From the Yonkers Statesman, November 9th, 1916. Headline: National results still uncertain, with President Wilson and Mr. Hughes both anxiously awaiting the count in a few western states. New Hampshire, previously considered sure for Mr. Hughes, was reported by Secretary of State Bean, with the returns complete but only partly verified, to have a lead for Mr. Wilson. The sudden switch of New Hampshire from a small Hughes plurality to 121 votes for Mr. Wilson was a dramatic change in the situation this morning. The news came from the Secretary of State to the effect that a partial official count of all the districts disclosed errors in tabulation by town and ward clerks. The official count is still progressing. In Minnesota and New Mexico, incomplete returns show Mr. Hughes is leading, while in California and North Dakota, Mr. Wilson is leading. Returns from the doubtful western states are belated and probably will not be available until a late hour today. The indicated electoral vote now stands: Wilson 255, Hughes 248, 33 doubtful. Headline: Striker returns to work on cars. The first trolley car striker to voluntarily return to work on the Yonkers Railroad was John Altman, alias Texas Jack, who was given his old position in the company's employ yesterday. Probably because of this so-called desertion and of the evidence of the last few days of the public's willingness to support the railroad in its efforts to provide the people of Yonkers with streetcar service, despite the existence of adverse legislation, minor disorders were frequent last night. After the cars had been stored in the barns for the night, and the consequent withdrawal of the police from the territory adjacent to the barns, gangs of strikers, numbering anywhere from 10 to 30 men, appeared from dark alleys, doorways, and saloons, to roam the streets and prey upon strikebreakers returning from their work. It was intimated in the City Hall this morning that the action proposed by the city authorities to bring a suit in the Supreme Court against the Yonkers Railroad Company on the complaint that the company had failed to comply with its franchise provision and operate cars on its various lines will not be carried into effect. It had been proposed, in the event the suit was started, to ask the court to appoint a temporary receiver of the company to operate the railroad until such time as the suit had been decided. This action also has been abandoned. In talking on the subject this morning, Assistant Corporation Counsel Cohen said that in preparation of the papers for his application to the court for the appointment of a receiver, he arrived at the conclusion that it was necessary that he should have information if the men would be willing to return to work under a receiver appointed by the court. Of course, said he, it would be ridiculous for the city authorities to ask the court to appoint a man to operate the railroad if the striking carmen would refuse to work under him. Hence, I sought to obtain from the representatives of the men some statement or guarantee. Anyway, the question as to whether they would be willing to work if a receiver were to be appointed was put up to the men last night, and they refused on the ground that by going back to work before the New York City strike was settled, they would be in a position of deserting their comrades. The action on the part of the union naturally compelled us to drop the proceedings. Headline: Strange engines employed in war. The mysterious British tank, described as a car of death resembling a ponderous, slow-moving steel caterpillar, is the current enfant terrible in the large family of strange engines of destruction sired by the gods of war, says a bulletin issued by the National Geographic Society. And that's the news from Yonkers, 100 years ago today.